Thank you, yeah, very much for that, Valerie. Lovely to be here, and yeah, lovely to be flanked by two extraordinary writers and thinkers. And yeah, I'm very passionate about Irish myth and how this feeds into literature. And so it's been a passion of mine. So I think it can be very interesting. And just to say, like, I'm not quite sure. So like at the end, maybe like.
We have a few minutes.
Yeah, 10, 15 minutes of questions. So if something comes up, I wish you talked more about that, or and that's a sort of chance for you to sort of ask a question or whatever, make a comment. I thought we just kick off with a question to you, Anthony, because this was called how Irish folklore, the impact it's made on sort of international literature. But can you just sort of say, what is the difference between myth and folklore?
That's a great question to start the day with. I don't know if there's a scientific definition, but I mean the biggest distinguishing factor between what we would call mythology and what we would call folklore is that folklore is what has survived orally, whereas mythology is mainly what was written down. And in Ireland that's very important because our mythological stories, as it were, so everything from Laura Gawala, Book of Invasions, to stories of the High Kings of Tara, to Táin Cúilge, all that stuff was written down in the Middle Ages. Actually, mostly by ecclesiastical scribes, which is interesting. A lot of our ostensibly pagan mythology, if you will, was written down by Christian hands. And the folklore would be, the stuff that some of us remember our grandparents telling us, maybe the story of, for instance, when I was a child, 3 stories that I knew. One which was very familiar because it's in the local landscape was the story of the salmon of knowledge, which of course was caught at the bend of the Boyne at Brunaboney, just a few miles from where I live. And we also find that tale was propagated in recent centuries as a folk tale, associated not just with the Boyne but with many other rivers. But actually the only manuscript in which it was written down, certainly the only surviving manuscript in which it was written down, it was only written once, and it's a few sentences, It's literally this very short story in Macníomhar ha Finn, the boyhood deeds of Finn. So sometimes we have folklore that is, shall we say, a survival of something that was mythological. It has been suggested that some of our folklore, for instance, if you look at stories of Finn McCool and you look at what was recorded in manuscripts, the two things are fairly similar, which I believe demonstrates a remarkable propensity for Irish people to tell stories.
Yes, yeah.
And we do tell stories, Whether you believe them or not is the big question,
Yeah. Well, and that's something we can talk about more about as well. It's a sort of something I'm interested in as well, as a sort of a confusion between literal truths and metaphorical truths. And I think that's something you explain so well as someone who's both interested in the monuments and the myths, and that you also see the poetry very much and the metaphor and the meaning of what these monuments stand for and also what the myths stand for.
Yeah. Well, something I suppose I've taken an interest in, certainly in recent years, is the depth psychology of mythology, in particular with reference to the work of C.G. Young and the likes of Joseph Campbell. And Campbell, I like how he talks about how mythology, that history at the end of the day is a distorted version of what has happened in a particular country or to a particular people. And it's distorted because history is written by the victor, therefore it's a form of propaganda. And that if you want to find a truer history of a people, then listen to their stories. There's a truth in mythology, sort of a universal truth, And I find it interesting that in medieval Ireland, the poet had such extremely high rank. The olive was almost sort of equal to the king in terms of authority and rank and not power as such, but I suppose consideration by the people. And then I have found it personally that my non-fiction work, which has done very well, commercially, has to be accompanied by what I can only describe as, well, you could call it fiction. I've written some fiction, I've written some short novels, but mythopoetic work, because the only way to actually make sense of it is to go into the depth of it and to explore it. And sometimes it only reveals its truth through metaphor and symbol. And it is through that exploration that I've come to realise some of the deeper truths that we're talking about pertaining to some of the stories that I would have written about, let's say, journalistically, you know. And the best example of that I can give you is my book that's called Return to Segish, which is not like anything I've written before, which I hand wrote, and is an extremely mythopoetic work. It helped me, I suppose. I don't think you ever get your head around some of the stuff, but it certainly helps you to go. It's like down into the well of Segish, or the Nectan's well, where Boyne was forbidden to go. No one shall look to the bottom of the well except for their eyes will burst out of their head. And there's a psychology there, which is you have to be careful when you look down into the deep waters. The water, Jungian, in Jungian terms, being the symbol of the dark psyche, the shadow, that you have to be careful when you go down there. You go down there in steps, you don't just plunge in, because you can be overwhelmed, you know.
I love that. I think, for me as well, that connection between the kind of the Jungian, the depth psychology, and the myths, I think, is so rich and so important, because I think it's not just a sort of fantasy genre. There is real meaning and depth, and it's wonderful that it's sort of, here are these ancient myths, and that they're so fresh, they're still so relevant to how we live today.
I think that's another thing. I think Campbell said that myth, or maybe it was Jung, maybe it was someone else, about the eternal relevance of mythology, that it yields new interpretations in every age.
Yeah.
It's never, this belongs to this period of history in the past, and that's when it's relevant to, and it can have no relevance today. The fact of mythology, I think, is that it allows itself to be subject to fresh interpretation. Yeah,
absolutely. And Heather, you've just blown in fresh from the hills of Tara.
Yes.
And Heather's blown in from Canada and been here for a month now, nearly.
Yes.
And so coming here, obviously, we've talked a bit, already, and you said how Montreal, the sort of the Irish, obviously, influence there. But can you give us a sense of how Celtic myth, Irish myth, folklore, how that's transmitted overseas, and perhaps how that's, influenced literature beyond these shores?
Sure. So you were talking about mythology and folklore. So when the Irish, I don't even know what to call it, the invasion, the Irish came in such huge numbers after the famine, and they came to Montreal, and it was largely, illiterate. So it all came from folklore and stories they were telling. And when they arrived, one time there was one year they came, there were 60,000 of them, and there was only 40,000 in Montreal. So they just kind of descended on these boats, and the boats were referred to as coffin ships. And everyone was terrified of them as they came down the Saint Laurent River, and they had guns out, and they were like, please, but they wouldn't let them dock anywhere because, and for a reason, because the boats were filled with typhoid and cholera, and they were like, the Irish will just kill us all. So they finally came to Montreal, and so, and everyone was terrified of them. But there was this area owned by a man named Griffin, so they're like, we'll just let all the Irish go to Griffintown until they, get their stuff together, and then they will go and populate the rest of the country. But the Irish said immediately, we are never leaving this island. It's wonderful here. And also it was the only place in North America, because of the French, where you could practice Catholicism. So they had no intention of going. And everyone, so they built this wall around Griffintown because there was still this idea of that they had the plague and they were going to infect everyone. And there were all these little Irish orphans who were running around. And actually, in all French literature in Quebec now, it is populated with magical orphans, and which came from Ireland. And there was a story once of a little Irish girl who was walking through the streets of Montreal, and everyone closed their doors, and they were screaming, and they're like, it's an Irish orphan on the loose. And so then they just started building, you know, very industrious, and they had no intention of leaving, so they started building their own city, and the Anglo-Irish elite went and looked, and they were writing reports, and they said, we don't understand what they're doing. They're making rows of houses, and at the end of every single block, they're building a pub. And the Irish were like, no, we need these pubs. And then it's actually really funny to read the English accounts of what the Irish were doing, because at one point they're like, do we need to send the police in? Because every Saturday night they go and beat each other up. But they're not actually killing one another, so they seem to enjoy it. So we'll just let them do that. And then actually, a funny tale too is everybody assumed Montreal would be the capital of Canada. And the Parliament, so Parliament was built there. But then the Irish had different fire brigades. Everyone had different fire brigades, and whoever got the water first on a fire would get a premium. So one day the Parliament caught on fire, and the Irish Catholic fire brigade went, and the Irish Protestant fire brigade went, and they got into a fist fight and wouldn't let the other put the fire on the Parliament, so the Parliament built down. So as a punishment to Montreal, they moved Parliament to the sleepiest town called Ottawa, and we're always like, why is the capital in Ottawa? And it's just because of the Irish. And the Irish started just immediately creating myths, and a lot of the myths that were in Irish mythology, they turned them into very Montreal ones, like the one about the headless horseman. There was this young woman named Mary Gallagher, and she had his best friend, and they were thick as thieves, but they got into a terrible fight, and Mary Gallagher's friend cut her head off. So all through Montreal, everybody said, like, Mary Gallagher was coming around looking for her head. And so you see these things change into a Montreal spirit. And then the oral storytelling in Montreal, the boxers became they were great Irish boxers, and every time they had a boxing match, they would give these wonderful introductions, and they were known, you know, as Joe, the comedian, Coughlin. And the Montreal newspapers would write about how funny it was, and the comedy they were performing, and they would tell Irish tales. And so it kind of, the Irish started creating this idea of comedy in Canada. And what's interesting is Saturday Night Live was started by Lorne Michael, who was Canadian, and he just brought all the Irish storytellers down to Saturday Night Live. And if you look at the background of the comedians in the States, they're all Canadian. If you watch Barbie, all the Kens happen to be Canadian. So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, and so that was Montreal, and there was different groups, like the ones who came to Newfoundland, they were so isolated that they actually continued to speak Gaelic, and they had their own dialect. That's why if you go to Newfoundland now, they still have Irish accents, and they really, because they came before, they weren't the kind of crazy Montreal famine ones. So they kept the mythology, and they have these wonderful traditions. Like they planted these apple trees that came from Ireland and passed their babies through it, even though the ministers and priests were like, stop passing your newborns through the branches of the tree. And they're like, okay, we won't. Like, quickly, put the babies through the trees. So there's just all different ways, and of course, in the boss. I mean, what you're seeing now is that's the American. That comes very much from the Boston mythology and the criminal mythology of the Irish in America.
Yeah, and of course, and this is imbued in so much of your writing, the sort of
The
criminality, the underworld, but the...
Exactly, because my father was an Irish thief, so he actually really wanted me to grow up to be a thief and a criminal, so he had taught me all these criminal ways. So, like, I want to be a writer.
A writer's a kind of thief, anyway. I mean, T.S. Eliot said,
to his dying day, he was disappointed that I didn't become a criminal, because he's like, you have the Irish gift. Police can't catch you.
And that makes me think as well, when you talk about, because a lot of your work as well is obviously and this again is connected to your own upbringing, the sense of being an orphan, but that connects very much to mythology as well, doesn't it? It's often the orphan who becomes the hero, who doesn't have a mother and father. Why? Can you say something about that, Anthony?
Well, yeah, and there are examples where the birth is miraculous, or at least at the very least suspicious. Orphans, and of course in mythology there's a huge tradition around fostering, the fostering of younglings, Angus is a great example, Angus Og, associated with Newgrange in the mythology, and in Tuckmark Etain how he's taken away to be fostered by Midger at Bray for, I don't know if it's 7 years or 9 years, he's very young anyway, and eventually one day he and the other fosterlings are out playing at Bray, and the other fosterlings start taunting him about not knowing who his parents are. And of course he hasn't been told the truth, which is Midger is not in fact his father, he's only his foster father. And he goes to Midger and he says, and he's naturally very upset, because the boys are slagging him off and telling him he doesn't know who his folks are, He says, well, who are my parents? And at this moment, Midger just says, come here, Ace, just sit down there now and take a seat now. The usual, when a child has gotten to the stage where you're telling it a few home truths, which is probably this is the sort of stuff that human beings, I think, have been dealing with since we were first able to communicate and express emotions, is looking after the children and, of course, guiding them through the difficult phases into adulthood, which I believe a lot of mythology is about anyway. We could talk, I suppose, for hours about the hero's journey, But anyway, Angus is told the truth, and this is so funny. First thing he says is, so Dogda's my father, Yochi Olahar, brilliant. Where shall I find him? Because I want to talk to him about my inheritance. It's not that, I'd love to go and meet my father for the first time. It's, I want to talk about what I'm owed, in terms of, but that's a significant theme in mythology. We find, for instance, I'm not sure if it's really connected with the idea of orphans, but I was just telling the story today at Tara about Niall of the 9 hostages, one of the most famous kings of Tara, and the miraculous nature of how he came to the kingship, because he encountered a hag at a well, and she wanted to kiss for the water, and his half-brothers had all met the same hag and refused, but he had embraced her, and she had revealed herself to be sovereignty. That his father, who was the High King, had a wife and 4 sons, and everything was just perfect. Everything's rosy. We're all set up here. My husband is the High King. I've got 4 sons. When he croaks it, when he keels over or dies in a battle, we've got 4 sons to take over. Everything's cushy, except for one small detail, which is the father or the husband, Yochi Mugmadone, decided to take upon himself a concubine, another woman. And so polygamy seems to be a thing in myth as well. So Niall's, and I think this plays in with the whole thing about the outsider, Niall is a threat from the get-go. As soon as the other lady is called Karen, not to be confused with K-A-R-E-N, but the Irish spelling C-A-I-R-E-N-N, and Karen is pregnant, and immediately, before the child is born, Yochi Mugmadone's wife, who is Mungint, which literally means bright mane or fair mane or blonde mane, blondie hair, she was immediately threatened and did everything in her power to make Karen miscarry the child. She made her do all the menial hard labour, as it were, building walls and chopping down trees and carrying the water and all of this stuff. But of course the child was born, but he was secreted away from Tara for a while and protected. It's almost like in the story, well, I suppose, look, this is, let's call a spade here, this is political too. This is the foundation myth of the O'Neill dynasty. This is how they, and the survivors can be found.
They are, not just tinkers.
This is the story that they told to legitimise, or to, I suppose, enshrine that origin that they had. That it's a little bit like, if you've ever heard Monty Python, so you're the king because some watery tart said something about a sword and a stone and that sort of stuff. it's sort of similar. So hang on, we're the kings of Ireland because Niall went off into the wilderness, met a crone, and frolicked around on the ground with her, and she transformed into a young woman and said, "You're going to be the High King," and you know your descendants for long afterwards. But your question is about orphans, and I really got sidetracked.
No, that's great. I mean, but I think as well it's interesting as well how the artist, whether a sort of a real literal sort of orphan or not, there's a sense of them being the other in society and being outside of the society and the importance of that. And it is interesting that sort of, with your background.
And is that why you kind of came feeling as an orphan from England to Ireland to look at those myths?
Well, no, I mean, I came to Ireland accidentally because of a woman. I was invited 23 years ago. And, but yeah, and I mean, for me it was a fascinating, obviously from England originally, and but Ireland, yeah, it's been a real sort of journey of discovery, because that's when I really started taking writing seriously, poetry seriously, and discovering, I lived down in Kinsale, and you know, you had Derek Mahon on one side of the hill, who was an extraordinary poet, and Desmond O'Grady, who was an extraordinary poet, and you know, so lots of writers, and it was the first time kind of meeting living writers, because I thought all poets were dead, you know, and you know, because I only read dead poets, you know, and so I thought, oh, this is still something. It's not just, you know, you don't just daydream under a tree. So that was a sort of real eye-opening moment, and then I got to know, particularly Desmond to begin with, Desmond O'Grady, who's a sort of major Irish poet, quite overlooked, became more of a European. He was a scholar, a Joycean and Celtic scholar, went to Harvard, was invited by Richard Ellman, Joyce's Wilde's biographer, and played himself in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, played himself in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, I should say, played the Irish poet, and he was a real rogue. And Desmond was Catholic and Derek was Protestant, and they were like so different as well. Like Desmond was this wild sort of pagan, but he became Ezra Pound's amanuensis, and his home was this tiny little cottage, and he had 3 desks in his cottage. So I'm going off now, but so one desk was for his own poetry, another desk was for his translations, and another desk for his memoirs. And he kind of went, you know, throughout, you know, and he had a microwave, which he called his microwife, and you know, no television or anything. It's like a little museum. And so I got to know Desmond, and that was sort of, and he introduced me to Irish mythology, to Celtic mythology. He had translated, the same time Kinsella did the Toyn, Desmond did the Gododin, which is this Welsh epic. And it was published by, you know, the same publisher, is it Dublin Press? I think they were, and Louis Le Brocquier, a great artist, did the illustrations for that. And so this was like, you know, and it was, for me, it was such an eye-opening thing, because I'd been traveling all around Africa and, you know, interested in a lot of those cultures and things. And then here I was, as an Englishman, coming to Ireland, so geographically close, and yet I'd never heard of any of these myths. And yet these myths as well were they were actually British myths as well. You know, the Celts, you know, they were connected. And so for me, that was a real eye-opener. And I suppose if you are going to read Irish poetry as well, you automatically then are learning about Irish mythology, because it's all over the literature. So that became my sort of, my interest, really.
Yeah, and when you say, are you, in this poetry, are we talking mythology and or folklore, or a mixture of? Both,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I mean, so in this book, this is the book I wrote about Celtic mythology. It's called The Hidden World of Poetry, Unraveling Celtic Mythology in Contemporary Irish Poetry. I could have put in folk, it was a long enough title as well, as I could have put Irish folklore in as well. I mean, yeah. But it does, so it's like, but we are looking at, I mean, you know, Uncaliach, which is a pre-Celtic, you know, so there's many things. But the idea of this book as well was that, you know, obviously we were aware of the Celtic revivalists and you know, Lady Gregory, Synge and Yeats and the work they did. But with this book here, it was about looking at contemporary Irish poets and also referring to mythology in a sort of non-kind of Celtic mist kind of way, that it wasn't, that these were poems very much firmly rooted in the 20th sort of century, but they alluded to Irish mythology. And I thought, if you weren't Irish as well, you weren't, in a way it was written for people maybe outside of Ireland, because you would miss a lot of these allusions. So that was the sort of the method behind the book.
Yeah, I think there's a sense with so your experience is interesting, you know, as you say, as a British person coming to Ireland. I've said, and it's a bit controversial at times, but I mean it, and I believe it. I believe that if you go back far enough, the Irish and the British see themselves as a distinguishable people. The only thing that separated us, if you go back far enough, is the Irish Sea. I believe that, for instance, in prehistory, there was a huge amount of cooperation, and I believe that the wider Neolithic communities, by the way, associated with the landscapes of Boyne and Orkney and Stonehenge, all knew each other. Probably didn't, again, distinguish this idea. But I wonder, what was it that was the undoing of Celtic mythology in Britain? I mean, it's generally attributed to the Romans, isn't it? That, you know, we're very lucky in Ireland. I think we're very, very fortunate to possess this incredible corpus of material. So much that has survived, a great deal of it because of the ecclesiastical. They weren't all church scribes, by the way. Some of those were bards. Some of those were lay scribes, as it were, people who'd been taken in by the monasteries who weren't expressly Christian or anything. You know, and there's an entire different discussion about the whole, because you alluded to it there, the idea of the babies in the tree and all of that stuff. Because I believe that the Irish, right down until we're now probably more a secular people, but until the early part of my life, when most Irish people were Catholic, I believe we were actually pagan Catholic. You know, we had this blend of Christianity and paganism. Anyway, without getting off the track too much, I'm very interested in the notion that, because I mean, Yeats was in Sligo and clearly, I think, got a huge amount of inspiration from the land. And if you read Moriarty, you get the sense, and I've mentioned it myself, you get the sense of the inspiration seeping out of the stones here and out of the landscape. Do you think if you go back to Britain before the Romans, that would have been the case across the way?
I've never been before definitely.
If
I could. Absolutely. I think Ireland, you know, it retained its Celtic identity. I mean, and look, I mean, God knows, you know, you think of when you look at the western fringes of Britain, when you've got Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, where they've retained more of their Celtic identity, obviously a lot more than the rest of the UK. But it makes you think, doesn't it, what monuments, you think, you're still discovering monuments in Ireland now, these extraordinary henges. It makes you think, what was Europe like as well? Because all of this was eroded by the Romans. So Ireland did retain its Celtic identity, no doubt, much because it wasn't Romanised.
Yeah.
And Normanised later even.
Well, yes, and I was going to mention, if you look at the eastern part of Ireland, where we're in the middle of the old Pale, you'll see that, the influence there has been quite strong in that, in the early part of the 20th century, you can look back at the stuff, the material that was collected by the Folklore Commission. You'll find that all the material they collected in the West was off Gaeilge, it was in Irish, but all the material they collected in the East, the majority of it is in English. And you even see that, as I say, the prosperous East-facing cities that are looking towards Britain and looking towards Europe are the ones that spoke English. But the old Celticism survived to a degree Moriarty lived in Connemara and seems to have just almost, you could imagine that there was a day on which John Moriarty just kind of morphed out of the rocks just announced himself one day, or grew out from a crevice in a rocky waterfall in a remote part of Connemara, that he just grew out one day and just sprouted this thick foliage, this mane of hair that he had, that he almost emerged from the stones. But I was just interested in that experience from the point of view of a British person, and I suppose this applies to that idea of folklore and mythology migrating across oceans. And how much is it related to the land? Was there something about Montreal that, I know that, for instance, people living in modern Washington State identify an awful lot with Ireland because of the climate. Was there something about Montreal that was familiar in terms of the landscape and maybe the climate as well?
I don't know, other than that it's an island, and they seem to also have loved Manhattan, which was also an island. But it's interesting, the idea of connection with the land, because that's been a huge discussion in Canada, because the Indigenous population who have been, they talk about they have a connection to the land and they have certain gods that live on that land. And for anyone who kind of is a settler, those gods we're not allowed to touch. They're like, they don't belong to you. If you write about them, they get very offended, because we sort of took everything as settlers away from them and perpetuated genocide, destroyed their, killed all the buffalo and the huskies in any way they had to live. So all they have now is their tales and their gods, and we are not allowed to have them. And so then I was like, well, if you do have this, and they're like, you don't have a connection to the land, the God speaks to us and not to you. So then I was curious when I came, so I was like, well, I'm going to go to Ireland then and see if there is a connection with the land. And I do feel the magic of it, and it's sort of the first time, like the first day I got here, I got mugged, and they took my cell phone away. And then, but then I had hired a driver to take me through Galway to see the sort of mythical spots where I could feel the fairies. And so I asked her if she knew anything about the Druids, and she said, I'm actually a practicing Druid. So then I had told her the story about my cell phone, and she said, when someone comes to Ireland to look at our myths, the gremlins, they always try and stop them. And I was like, of course. That happened to me. The gremlins came and they took my telephone. And then I was reading W.B. Yeats, and he said the witching hour in Dublin is at 9 a.m. in the morning. And I'm like, absolutely. I won't leave my house at 9 a.m. in the morning. All the thieves are out, and it's terrifying. So, and I thought that was interesting. But then going through, and then I found, traveling through Ireland, everybody was sharing with me their stories about fairies and telling me the different ways. And then even I was teaching a class here in magical realism, the students all had wonderful tales, and they're like, yes, if the fairies do something good for you, they take something back. And so it's just nice to be able to participate in the culture of the land.
Yeah, if you'd been trained properly, you would have stolen your phone back.
Probably. I've been trying.
but that's something as well about allowing the land to speak to you, being open to that, and that becoming, that idea of sort of Irish identity as well, what does it mean to be Irish? I think you talk about this beautifully, Anthony, that it is that sort of, and I think, maybe that's what sort of with any culture is as well as allowing the culture to speak to you, being open to its land as well to speak to you, and that is a way to sort of not then take from it, but be open to it, to receiving it.
Yeah. I'm not perhaps well travelled enough to comment on this, but I will say one thing about Ireland, which when I was a kid, when we were in secondary school, in particular in the 1980s, our teachers were telling us, you're going to have to emigrate because you're not going to get work here, because we were in the middle of the depression, mass emigration. Ireland had at one stage 20% interest rates. People struggled to keep a roof over their heads, and I know all that sounds familiar in certain ways, and recurring themes and all of that. But so one thing that struck me about Irish mythology is that we have a huge emphasis on land and places, natural features, mountains, lakes, the eruption of rivers, the creation of rivers. Every field, every well, every stream, every hill, every single feature in Ireland has a name, and in some cases several names, and an indication of how this is not just a modern thing, this is rooted in tradition, is the fact that, so I was mentioning earlier that everybody in Ireland, I think probably 90% of people, if you've heard one of our myths, you've heard the story of the Salmon of Knowledge or the Children of Lear. But the Salmon of Knowledge, as I said, only recorded in one manuscript. Now flip that. Dinshamachus, or Dinchiamachus if you prefer the correct spelling, the material pertaining to the naming of places and the origins of important, eminent places. There's Dinchiamachus material in at least 12 manuscripts, if not more. And that to me speaks volumes about the importance of this. This is where we get to the nub of that Irishness that's rooted in land and landscape. It's why the Irish still, I believe, are a little bit maybe old-fashioned and conservative when it comes to development. I don't think we ever wanted to become, a a modern European country from the point of view of the infrastructure, because if we got developed cities and motorway networks and rail networks and all of that stuff and growing towns and expanding towns, we would lose that very close connection with the land. And I believe that's why, especially when you go west of the Shannon, you almost feel like you're going into an old world. It's like it's a surviving remnant of something that is pre-industrial, pre-modern. It still holds on to its old Celticism, its old, if that's the word that you use. I don't use the word Celtic in my work because it's tainted. It's slightly tainted. And anyway, the geneticists are saying now that the Irish language didn't come in with the Celts at all. It was already here with the Bronze Age, with the Beaker people. And I just, for me, it's that aspect of my work is that I have found myself greatly inspired as a writer by not just reading the academic texts and reading the mythological texts, but actually spending time in the landscapes that I was writing about. And especially, at times when, for instance, there weren't a lot of other people around, like Newgrange is an amazing place in the evening time, when all the tour buses are gone and a hush descends on the landscape, and you listen to the last blackbirds and the last robins singing out the evening, and you see the first bats appear, and you see the very first indication of stars. That road past Newgrange is almost empty of traffic because it's only a local road, and suddenly it's like you're in a different place altogether. And I believe that spending a lot of time there over the past 2 decades in particular has been very important to the depth of my work. And that feeling of getting inspiration from a place, a land, a monumental landscape.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think one of the things, I think that maybe this leads us as well into sort of how this can affect literature and modernism. This is another interest of mine. There's a psychologist, Peter O'Connor, and he asserts in his brilliant book, Beyond the Mist, he says, Irish mythology, unlike Greek or Roman, is not linear, but meandering. He writes that Celtic myth is dominated by what he calls an archetypal feminine ambience. There's a sense of connectedness and interconnectedness with the Celtic psyche, not logos and separateness. That quality is echoed by Marie-Louise Justet, a French linguist and literary scholar who specialised in Celtic studies, especially Irish mythology. She writes that the peculiar difficulty with the mythological world of the Celts is that when seeking an approach to it, you find you're already in it. One has to artificially contrive a beginning in what otherwise feels like a cycle of interconnected themes and characters. And I'm interested in that aspect because I think a lot of, we see this especially with Joyce, breaking that linearity. This was a big part of modernism, of sort of capturing the psyche, if you like. And also, Heather, you bring sort of obviously a female perspective to your work. Can you say something about that feminine aspect? Is this sort of, have you noticed that sort of feminine ambience in Ireland or with the Irish myths? Is that something that comes across to you?
Well, in response to what Anthony was saying, it's interesting as an immigrant because there's so much of the Irish myth that has to do with the land. And then as an immigrant in a different land, it was the Irish people themselves who were considered sort of having magical powers and having these, you were lucky. Like my grandmother was a fortune teller, and I actually looked in her genealogy because I was like, O'Neill, I'm going to be a king. And they're like, I think she was Tinker. And I was like, oh, why have we always been down and out? But anyways, she would, because she was an Irish fortune teller, and she would tell, she just had so many clients from different cities, particularly during World War II. It was like a lineup down the street because people wanted to know what was happening with their children. And then when I was a little girl, first I was raised by my mother, and then when I was 7, then she said, oh, your dad's out of jail, he can take care of you now. So she sent me to Montreal, and I lived in my dad had 9 brothers, and they were all thieves, so I was raised in this very, masculine world. But then one day I started telling the future. I predicted somebody down the street her husband had just died, and she was 55, and I said, don't worry, she'll be married within the year. And then she got married within the year, and then it was like, my dad was like, oh, you have the gift. So he would always take me with him when he was in court, and then he said, whenever Heather is with me, I get off. So then all his friends started like borrowing me and taking me to their court cases because it was luck. And then they started then it got really corrupted. They had me bribing the prosecutors, and I'm like, I don't know what this has to do with magic. They were like, just give it to the prosecutor, and I would go with this envelope. I was 9 years old, and I was like, Joe McGilligan wants to give this to the charity of your choice, and then he would get off. But it was sort of, there was this idea about it. So every time anything good happens to me in like Montreal, they're like, oh, it's the luck of the Irish. And I was like, I don't know if the Irish are particularly lucky if you look at their history. But but it's interesting within that you kind of have to carry as an immigrant all the myths within yourself, but you don't have the connection to the land. And as far as the feminine, and then within sort of these Irish communities, the women became like midwives, and there was a lot of street workers, but they just had all these different elements, and that's what I'm always interested in my writing, because everybody knows what the male thieves did, or the male boxers, or the builders, and they became politicians. But all the roles of the women within the Montreal society, and that people would go and they would have spells, but also just medicines and health care. And if you were poor, you would go see the Irish women, and they would could deliver your babies for you, or give you poultices or whatever. So it was a really interesting role that the Irish women, whether or not they were actually magic, they accepted this and became these kind of pillars in the underground.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we've only got 10 minutes left, so we'll open it to the floor in a sec. But one thing we're only sort of skirting on the surface here, but sort of going back to someone like Joseph Campbell, who was a mythologist, and I think he's a really interesting character because he's such a sort of extraordinary figure, if you're interested in world mythology. But it's interesting to note that, kind of going back to modernism, I suppose, that Campbell's idea of this monomyth, so it was a sort of Jungian idea as well, but that theory really came about from reading Ulysses. He read Ulysses in Paris and was completely beguiled and bewildered by it, and asked Sylvia Beach, what the hell is this about? And she gave him some books to read. And it was really from that he came up with this monomyth. And I'm kind of fascinated by that. And also that Campbell spent time in Ireland, I think, as a young man, sort of travelling around. And I think that's fascinating, that sort of this kind of extraordinary, out of Ulysses came this term called the mythic method, which T.S. Eliot came up with. Like, after reading Ulysses, he saw that what Joyce had done with the novel, with literature, was as important as a scientific discovery, because it was, again, not just this linear plot, that it was this mythic sort of underbed that you could go below, and the symbols could sort of take you through. And I think that's really fascinating, and how that sort of affected art and literature,
Yeah, I wouldn't be familiar, for instance, with Joyce's knowledge of mythology, but I know Campbell's came about, first of all, shall we say, academically through reading. He spent 5 years of the Great Depression reading books because he couldn't get a job. And greatly inspired by it. But I know during his life he spent a lot of time in the places that he studied and met people. So, it's both academic and I suppose what we might call natural, organic, as it were. What was the question? Sorry.
No, I'm going to give you a question.
I'm going to for you too.
Okay, all right, quick one.
The writing that comes out of Newfoundland is a lot more lyrical, and they spoke Gaelic a lot longer. And I'm wondering what the influence of Gaelic has to do, that very peculiar, wild writing that's still, everything that comes out of Ireland, I think, is the most inventive writing right now in the English language.
Yeah.
And they take such leaps, and I was wondering, what connection does that have to Gaelic? Or
Irish is a very, I don't speak Irish, but it's a very, I can read a little bit of it, but it is a lot more lyrical. And I think, as you said, Irish talk a lot. It's the Celtic, it's a conversational culture, but...
Yeah.
Can you say something about...
All I can say in relation to the Irish, I love that when you talked about linearity versus meandering. ask an Irish person for directions, and it won't be middle, beginning, middle, end. Like a story is never with an Irish person beginning, middle, end. It's like the beginning, and then there's this bit that happened, and she went off here, over here, and then this thing happened to her, and then and like half an hour later, with your eyeballs rolling around in your head, you're like, where are we going with this exactly? And there's never a beginning or an end even. And then
Like Finnegan's Wake.
You look at the megalithic art that's on the stones from centuries, and you see circularity, you see serpentine, you see this notion of non-linearity. It's like when the Irish person is asked for directions, tell me how to get to the Hill of Tara, please. And the fellow at the side of the road scratches his head. Look, so one way up the road, and then the other way, and goes, I'll be honest with you, love, if I was heading to the Hill of Tara, I wouldn't start from here. And that, I think, encapsulates that Irish spirit of, I believe part of that maybe stems from imperialism and refusing to be shackled and refusing to be shaped. I mean, it was one of the things that the British said about the Irish, was that they were intransigent or uncontrollable when it came to time. Everything's regulated by time. It's like, we start at 8 a.m, we work until blah, 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 we have lunch, we do this. And the Irish were like, nah, clocks.
And on that note,
we're
going to move over.
Yes, time.
It's about time.
We're only just getting started.